You may not realize it, but the American Indians living right here in North America at the time that the Europeans arrived could give us a first-class lesson on communism. You might not have thought of the American Indians as being communists, but what I mean by communists, simply they were as pure a form of communist as you'll ever see. They had no money, they had no social classes, everybody was equal. They lived in communes, and that's what the word communism means, commune. Communes. In other words, they lived in villages, and they were all fairly equal. They did have a chief, and they did have a medicine man. You sometimes might call him a witch doctor or a shaman, but they lived in villages. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they were as evil as the Marxist-Leninist communists that came later, and yes, for those of you who might have communist leanings, you just heard me say that I think communism, that Marxist-Leninist communism is evil. If that offends you, all I can say is I'm sorry, but nevertheless, I do think so. The Americans, just because I say they were communists doesn't mean necessarily that I think they were evil. They simply tried an experiment in social government, an experiment in economics and government that led them toward a path of total, actually you have to call it uncivilized. And again, I mean, that word uncivilized has an emotional tone to it, I know, but they were looked on as being uncivilized because they could not form or organize themselves into anything better than a local tribe. All right. Now, we'll start at the beginning now. Having gotten there at the beginning, most historians today say that they believe the American Indians came across the Bering Strait and migrated by foot from China. I know they have Asiatic origins, Mongolian particularly, and they went from Mongolia across the Bering Strait during the Ice Age, when you could walk from Siberia to Alaska on foot. They believe a lot of the herds, because you find the same type of animals that you find in Alaska, you also find in Siberia, most particularly being the woolly mammoth, which is now extinct. There is a problem with that, in that all the American Indians who seem to know anything about where they come from all said we came from across the seas. It is now known you can cross an ocean in a rowboat, carrying just a little bit of water and a little bit of dried up food, dried to preserve it. You can cross the ocean, and this is even more true of the big Pacific and the Atlantic, because the Pacific is not always, but generally calmer. That's what the word Pacific means, a calmer ocean than the more turbulent Atlantic. Now, again, there's numerous times when there's an exception to that. But the standard view is they are Mongolian in race, Mongolian in genotype, came across and spread all the way down through here and spread through the Americans, having originated right here at the point where the Siberia comes close to Alaska. The earlier Indians are believed to have developed a system of hunting, and well, any way you look at it, life was more abundant at one time than it is now. The buffalo they would have hunted at one time were about as big as elephants are today. This, folk, you can verify by doing a little bit of research. They are believed to have eventually learned how to plant. And some of their plants were corn and squash, certain types of beans. And in fact, the Indians in Guatemala are believed to be the first persons to plant what we today would call corn. The corn that we see in our stores is not the same as the Indians planted. The corn we have is a hybrid. It's all yellow. What the Indians had was a corn that was all kinds of colors, including yellow, mostly red. Some of you probably might know what I'm talking about. Anyway, they eventually, so some of them eventually civilized. Now, here's where I'm taking a little bit of liberty to disagree with the authors. My personal view is they came from, some of them came from Asia, and some of them came from Europe, and yes, some of them, the Olmec in particular. Now, I've had more than one African student say that they believe that the Olmecs were actually African and not American Indians who came across the Atlantic from Africa. A whole lot of the statues you find of the Olmec show very, very pronounced African features. But I think that also initially they were highly developed and highly civilized, and they were not progressing upward, they were regressing downward. Now, having said that, have any of you seen the Etowah Indian mounds nearby? Okay, a couple of you. I was just there about 2 weeks ago, folks. I said to my wife, hey, I haven't been in 30 years, and I've forgotten a lot about it, so I went. She and I went back. And what impresses me was they appeared to have had a high level of organization and much more than a tribe. But as time went on, instead of progressing upward to a better civilization, they regressed downward. Now, the Etowah site shows that they had trade. Some of the things you find at Etowah could only have been found in California. They traded with California, Florida, Wisconsin, Alabama, Missouri. So in other words, at one time they traveled. But by the time the Europeans met them, they were living in wigwams, huts. The ones in the Great Plains lived in teepees. And they had regressed quite noticeably downward. Well, what happened to cause them to lose the civilization they once had? Again, I think a new idea took hold and spread, and that new idea was what I'd call communism, for lack of a better term. They simply thought that communism would solve all their problems, and they didn't have anyone to resist it, nobody to say, hey, this will lead us downhill. They became communistic and thought they were improving, but actually their population continued to decline. Their way of life continued to decline. It did not bring peace. Now, I've had pupils tell me that the Indians were living here just peacefully, not bothering anybody, and then the white man came and upset the peaceful balance that they had. The fact is, their bodies, when we dig them up, or when we exhume them, when we run into their skeletons we find in caves, it shows that they were as addicted to warfare as any group. There's no group of people, no nation that has found a cure for warfare for it. We've tried harder in my generation, perhaps than the other, when war became so terrible. And just about the time you think that we've solved the problem, we're about to have peace, some group comes along that forces us into a war that we don't want. Peace seems to be an elusive product. Well, the American Indians had warfare and a lot of it, and it contributed to the downturn of their civilization. All right. The earliest civilization we know of, now this is somewhat surprising in view of the fact that today in the modern world, the area that we call the United States is the most developed area of North America, pardon me, the most developed area of all the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. But at that time, the most developed was either Mexico and Central America. The earliest civilizations we know about were the Olmec. And I've already written that down. The Olmec civilization apparently had writing, but their writing has not been deciphered. They flourished for a while. They built large cities, large temples, and actually had a civilization that probably had, their main city had a population that might have been greater than 50 to 100,000 people. They had art, and some of their art has come down to us. But as is the case of so many civilizations, their civilization disappeared, went downhill. Again, we don't know for sure what happened to it. Now, the next group I want to talk about are the Aztecs. The Aztecs apparently started out as a small group. It appears that they were just roaming tribes people, and they went in and conquered their more civilized neighbors. All right, now, folks, having said that, I want to digress. Throughout history, you find a fight between civilized and uncivilized. And when civilized fight uncivilized, does anybody know who wins most of the time? Barbarians, the uncivilized. Now, there was an exception. When Europeans came and invaded the New World, the Europeans won, and the Indians lost. I'll go into reasons for that, next time. But in general, the barbaric people, the uncivilized, went out over their civilized neighbors. I say that, not tongue in cheek. Just last spring, I had one of my better pupils sat in that seat right here in the front row, and he said, the United States cannot be conquered. Nobody in the class agreed with it, maybe because they knew that I disagreed with it. Right now, the world is being beset by a bunch of people that some of us would call uncivilized. And I shudder to think that as it's happened down through the ages, the uncivilized people can win. Not easily, but they can win. The United States could lose. All right, anybody want to disagree with that? I don't want to argue, I'll let you speak. Anybody have any comments? Again, it's time and time in history. The Sumerians, civilized people conquered by the semi-civilized Amorites. The Romans, destroyed by the Huns and by the German barbarians. The Greeks, conquered by Philip of Macedon. The Macedonians they looked on as being semi-barbarians. The Etruscans, conquered by their less civilized Latin neighbors. The Babylon, conquered by their less civilized neighbors, the Hittites. Over and over again. The Aztecs then developed a civilization of their own, but that's a subject for a later time. All right. Having introduced you to the American Indians, we'll